Eagle kami, di mapipigil sa pagbabalitang tumpak at tama. Buhay atenista, sa loob sa labas ng eskwela, ating ibibida lahat ng eskwela. Radyo, Katipunan. Radyo, Katipunan. Kawal ni Ignacio, Katipunero sugod, todo sa kayod, punong at tulong. Lipad na Blue Eagle, galing hiting at gigil. Blue and white, one big fight. Radyo, Katipunan. Radyo, Katipunan.
Susunod na ang Lundagin mo, Beybeh sa Radyo Katipunan 87.9 FM.
Radyo Katipunan.
Radyo, 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 Radyo Katipunan. Radyo Katipunan. Radyo Katipunan. Radyo, Radyo, Radyo Katipunan. Radyo, Radyo, Radyo Katipunan. Sa Blue Eagle kami di mapipigil sa pagbabalitang tumpak at tama. Buhay atenista, sa loob sa labas ng eskwela, ating ibibida lahat ng kwela. Radyo, Radyo, Radyo Katipunan. Radyo, Radyo, Radyo Katipunan. Radyo Katipunan. Radyo Katipunan. Kawal ni Ignacio, Katipunero sugod, todo sa kayod, tulong at tulong. Lipat na Blue Eagle, galing giting nagigil. Blue and white, one big fight. Radyo, Radyo, Radyo Katipunan. Radyo, Radyo, Radyo Katipunan. Radyo Katipunan. Radyo Katipunan. Radyo, Radyo, Radyo Katipunan. Radyo Katipunan.
Meron? Ano nga ba ang meron? Paano nga bang mabuhay ng tapat sa meron? Don't you wish you can relive your philo classes? The terror teachers? The terrible oral exams? Or the even terrifying but liberating and life-changing aha moments? Lundagin mo, Beybeh! Here's your chance! Lundagin mo, Beybeh! Kasama ang mga pilosopong sina Jovi Miroy at Ron Kapinding. Lundagin mo, Beybeh! Leaping upward, leaping forward. Lundagin mo, Beybeh! Leaping to greater heights, to greater wisdom, to greater magis. Lundag na, Ateneo!
Magandang gabi po sa ating pong mga tagapakinig sa Radyo Katipunan. Muli po, muli na naman tumutugtog ang inyong programa, Lundagin mo, Beybeh, dito sa Radyo Katipunan. Una po sa lahat, kami po ay humihingi ng paumanhin dahil po ang ating pangunahing host, si Dr. Jovi Miroy, ay kasalukuyang may inaasikaso. Kaya kami po ang inyong replacement bus service ngayon sa gabing ito. So muli po, ako po si Hans mula sa Kagwaran Naghambak Politika at kasama po uli natin ang ating bagong co-host, si Atty. Jonry Mendoza. Atty. Jonry, magandang gabi.
Magandang gabi po sa inyong lahat at magandang gabi po sa lahat ng tagapakinig ng Lundagin mo, Beybeh.
Yeah. So kumusta po ulit po ang trabaho natin today, Atty. Jonry? Kayo po ang may trabaho yata today.
Oo. Actually, nasa opisina pa rin ako ngayon. So, at wala kaming aircon. So, kaya pinapawisan na ako.
Yeah.
habang ginagawa natin tong interview. Pawis na yung
The same could be said dahil ako ay nandito sa bahay nagre-record, pero wag na nating wag na nating i-bring up 'yon. Pero before we begin, para lang din for for the benefit lang din po ng atin pong mga kasama dyan sa inyong opisina, Attorney Jonry, nabanggitin niyo na may gusto raw kayong ipakilalang mga kasama sa opisina.
Oo. Teka. May mga office mate ako na gustong magpa-shout out pero hindi ko na mahanap kung nasan sila ngayon. Guys, anyway,
Okay.
yung mga office mate ko from Universal Vision are always tuning in sa ating weekly radio program. So they'd like to say hello to us. Yeah, yun lang.
Maraming salamat po sa pagsuporta at sa pagpapalaganap din po ng ating programa. That being said, ang ating programa ngayon ay long prepared for and mukhang maraming huhukayin lalo at ever since nagkaroon ng major development sa United States early this year. Kailangan ba siya officially na inaugurate? Last week of January,
January, January
Yeah.
20 yata, January 20, 25.
Yeah. So last week of January, na-inaugurate ang dating 45th, ngayon ay 47th na ulit na Pangulo ng Estados Unidos na si Donald J. Trump. And like many things about Donald J. Trump, karamihan sa kanyang mga ginagawa at nakasangkutan ay subject sa debate, subject sa away at sa sama ng loob ng mga tao. So sa pananaw ng ating programa, mukhang ito naman ay oportunidad nga na pagnilayan din at siguro tignan din ang epekto nito sa atin bilang mga Pilipino, no? So in your field ba, Atty. Jonry, gaano kabigat ang mga development sa Amerika whenever you guys are dealing with things?
Actually, ang sinusubaybayan namin sa field namin sa mga with respect to mga development sa Amerika is yung mga legal changes, like for example yung sa TikTok versus Garland, yung decision ng US Supreme Court, basically agreeing to the act passed by the United States Congress na in effect saying na TikTok has to be shut down if yung Chinese ownership nun is hindi mabigay sa ibang ownership group, no? So I think now they're exploring the possibility of Americans owning 50% of TikTok. So yan yung isa sa mga sinusubaybayan namin.
Yeah. In our case naman dito, siguro hindi naman na kayo siguro mabibigla na dito sa pamantasan, napakalaking puzzle or hamon sa aming mga guro, lalo sa mga nagtuturo ng agham panglipunan na so bakit tayo pabalik-balik dito sa cycle na ito na tayo ay naghahalal or we elect people who either are clearly supposedly not worth it or people who are not to be trusted with public office. So bagaman ito ay napag-usapan na namin ni Doc Jovi nung ako ay unang bumisita bago pa ako naging bahagi ng show nung 2021, nung siya ay natalo ni Joe Biden. Since nandito ulit tayo, pang ripe ulit siya na pagnilayan at himayin. Lalo na so many things that are being done by the United States will have a direct impact on the Philippines. And that's why, because of that, we are very lucky to have with us today is it fair to say, one of the rising names of De La Salle University Manila's International Studies Program. He is currently a well-published and frequently interviewed resource person on both print and audiovisual media. I've had the pleasure of sharing byline space with him in the newspapers. And pakilala na po natin ang ating bisita, si Mr. Don McLain Gill of De La Salle University. Good evening, sir.
Good evening. Maraming pong salamat sa pagkakataong ito, and I look forward to having this interesting discussion.
Yeah, thank you. And before we begin, I hope you don't mind me asking some professional and personal questions muna. What brought you to De La Salle ISD?
Well, initially my venture towards the field of international relations and international politics started off quite at an early age. Started off as a form of curiosity in trying to understand and make sense of how the world works, and eventually began to focus on this at a more academic level. I took my further studies in the United Kingdom and eventually specialized in both theoretical and practical sense in the field of foreign policy analysis and maritime security issues. So the areas that I work with are in line with Philippine foreign policy, India, Southeast Asian security relations, and of course, Indo-Pacific maritime security. And it is, of course, a great honor to have had the opportunity and to have this opportunity to be part of the fantastic faculty of the Department of International Studies at De La Salle University, where we have a broad range of expertise ranging from traditional to non-traditional aspects of international politics, and of course, various interdisciplinary aspects that we could eventually link to the field of study as well. So it is definitely wonderful to be part of the such a fantastic team and to work from there, in order to engage with our students and engage out of the university as well, representing the country, representing the university in various capacities.
Mhm. May initial questions na ba kayo, Attorney Johnny?
Ikaw muna, Hansley. Oo. Ako,
Yeah.
naka-ready na
Sige,
yung sa akin, pero you take the lead.
sige, salamat. Sige, with that in mind siguro, Sir Don, since you're clearly already well immersed in the field of international affairs and both traditional and non-traditional security, what would you say are the current issues, I guess, we have in the Philippines, particularly when it comes to international security affairs? Parang pagdating ba sa ganitong usapan, do you get the sense that people are already conscious of the important things that needs to be talked about, or do you feel na the conversation on this is still pretty active? Like something needs to happen in the outside first before Filipinos think about, okay, why is this happening? What do we need to do?
Well, initially when we talk about public opinion and narrative formulation at the national level, in any society, in any state, there has to be a trigger, there has to be a catalyst. But then again, how you manage that and how you sort of repackage that at the national level would eventually depend on how public opinion sort of absorbs these critical information and eventually turn it into a public discourse. Now, in our case, for instance, one of the most pressing security issues that the Philippines has been facing, in fact, I'd like to say since towards the end of the 20th century, is the security of the West Philippine Sea. The 200 nautical mile exclusive economic zone encompassing the part of the South China Sea that entails our sovereignty and sovereign rights based on UNCLOS and the 2016 arbitral ruling. Now, of course, this has begun much earlier on. We talk about the illegal occupation of Mischief Reef in the 1990s, and eventually how this is today transformed into a full-fledged military base of China within our exclusive economic zone, to the point that it has offensive capabilities that clearly provoke the very essence of our national security interests. But then again, we have to understand our conscious shift from internal security to territorial defense and maritime security only began to take place somewhere in 2010. And it is quite ironic, being an archipelagic nation of over 7,100 plus islands and counting. This is quite interesting that our shift towards the maritime space, towards territorial defense in that regard, was actually, quite slow. But eventually, as we began to grasp with the issue, we began to focus on our capacity building and our maritime security capabilities through the Horizons projects, for instance. But when we talk about public opinion and how public perception sort of treated these issues. I'd like to say that in the early stages from 2010, under the Aquino administration, the former Aquino administration, this was still considered to be a largely elitist issue. When it comes to maritime security and geopolitics, this was seen largely as an elitist issue, whereas the common people were more interested in issues of bread and butter, obviously for practical reasons. And then you had the Duterte administration that sought to sort of push everything under the carpet, making it seem that there is nothing that is going on, that everything is in fact stabilized, especially with our northern neighbor, with the hope of attaining economic concessions, which was largely a misplaced hope. But then again, of course, there were several things that occurred. So we tried to, Manila at that time tried to have an appeasement approach towards Beijing, but nothing really transpired from that. We had the provocations around Sandy Cay in the 2017 period. 2019, you had a Chinese vessel ram obliterate a small Filipino fishing vessel, leaving our Filipino crew to drown. It was actually the Vietnamese Coast Guard that helped us. And then from 2020 to the early parts of 2022, we had China's maritime militia operate extensively with its swarming activities, which were sort of which is often considered as a prerequisite for illegal occupation, similar to what took place at the Scarborough Shoal in 2012, where the Bajo de Masinloc. But then again, if we look into public opinion, there were two nationwide polls that were conducted in 2019 at the peak of the former administration, and over 80%, if I'm not mistaken, showed dissatisfaction towards how Manila seems to be turning a blind eye on the clear provocations of China. But then again, because you had a state apparatus that was trying to undermine, for instance, the 2016 arbitral ruling, it was difficult to have that sort of alignment, despite the fact that our defense and foreign policy establishments were quite clear in pushing back against the aggressiveness and coercive tendencies of China within our lawful waters. Now, under the Marcos Jr. administration, I could see that there are various collaborations taking place between state actors and civil society groups operationalizing the transparency initiative that has brought light for the Filipino people with what is taking place within their respective waters. And this, when you see, our fisher folk being rammed, being water cannoned and having their livelihood stolen illegally within the clear lawful waters of Philippine sovereign rights, that becomes a unifying factor, that this is not just an elitist issue, but an issue concerning the common Filipino population. That this is not just about the military, it's not just about state actors, but also the common folk. And this has, as we can see, for the various polls that have been taken, the SWS survey, Pulse Asia, Okta Research, and since 2023, there has been a constant increase in public support regarding the government's position in the West Philippine Sea. But of course, critics have been quick to point out that the Transparency Initiative is not doing much at sea. But then again, we have to understand that China's expansionism, for instance, is not limited to the maritime or the physical space. It deals with malign information operations, espionage networks that aim to create public discord, and again, leading to political discord, and eventually to create a wedge between the Philippines and its partners in terms of foreign policy. We have seen the devastating effects, for instance, of these malign information operations, PRC-led, in countries in the South Pacific, in the Western Indian Ocean region, that have completely destabilized states. But fortunately, the Filipino people, along with the state mechanism, remains quite resilient. We continue to be vulnerable. So there's a lot that we can see in terms of this.
Yeah. Thanks for that, Sir Don. But this should neatly lead us, I guess, to our transition to our conversation regarding Trump's return to the White House. No? But one gets the impression, at least based sa nabanggit ninyo, na the Philippines has a lot of external security issues to deal with. A lot of it is mostly caused by China, and because of that, um, we have this dilemma na we want to stand up to China, but clearly we do not have all of our resources and capacities to do so. So which is why we have been using international relations to work with this. At the same time, siguro hindi naman to maling i-invoke. There are people who feel na when our international relations strategy involves the United States, it feels like it's it feels like we are falling back into that, post-colonial trap, so to say. Na I thought we were an independent country. Why do we keep relying on our former colonial masters still? Do you get the impression that people are beginning to move away from that, or this is still a pressing concern?
Yeah, well, clearly there are marginal groups that try to bring this up, and it's not just with the Americans; it's also with the Japanese. If when we had the RAA negotiations, there were some small groups of influencers and media people that tried to bring back the imperialist past of Japan to say that exactly the same narrative. Are we falling back into the devastations that have occurred during the Second World War, etc. Yes, history is very important, but history also shows us that we have to be more aware and adapt to the changing realities of the world. And what we can clearly see is that as far as imperialism is concerned, as far as expansionism is concerned, that the United States and Japan in that regard are in fact far from that description. What we clearly see is a de facto occupation of our waters by our northern neighbor. And if we look into Japan, which has been one of the most powerful and one of the most important contributors to the revitalization of our Coast Guard. We have South Korea and Japan, who have also played a huge role in our military modernization. And of course, the United States having that clear capacity, being our sole treaty ally. Yes, many may try to bring up the issues of 2012, for instance, which rightfully so has put a lot of question on the commitments of the United States towards the Philippines, etc. But that is a two-way street at the end of the day. And what we can see here is that along with the structural dynamics that are constantly exacerbating as we speak, there is also that willingness in Manila to generate more agency as an active stakeholder of the rules-based order in the Indo-Pacific. And I think that this was clearly outlined by President Marcos Jr. at the Shangri-La Dialogue last year, where, in fact, I'd like to say was the first clear address that really encompassed a holistic and comprehensive Philippine vision for the Indo-Pacific, when he said that our interests are not only limited to Southeast Asia or the Western Pacific. We have interests down to our South Pacific regions, and we also have interests across in the Indian Ocean region. And that in itself shows that the Philippines is willing to elevate the level of its agency. Because when we try to make arguments about the Philippines falling back into as a puppet of the United States, etc., we are basically towing the Chinese line. And if you look at the Global Times, you look at China Daily, that is the major narrative that they are trying to put forward to persuade the local audience here that we are doing nothing but following orders from Uncle Sam. But then again, if we look into the patterns of our approach, we are far from being a very a linear approach that only entails a unidirectional approach. In fact, under Marcos Jr., we have been pursuing a more multi-aligned approach, working with both traditional and non-traditional partners. programs in order to generate the most that we can achieve from these partnerships. But of course, when it comes to the aspects of material capability development, there aren't a lot of countries that have the same capacity as the United States to do so. But then again, we are also bolstering our relationship with France, which is something that I also consider to be an important and natural step. We are supposed to get around 46 vessels, Parola class vessels for our Coast Guard in the span of 7 years, 40 from France, and I believe 6 or 7 from Japan, making the Philippines then one of the largest coast guards in Southeast Asia. So when we also look at that, we also have to appreciate the national efforts that we are doing. You know, we have the comprehensive archipelagic defense concept, which clearly puts into perspective the clarity of our long-term vision as an archipelagic state. And that is that we are not only concerned about our archipelagic waters and the territorial sea, which is 12 nautical miles, but we are looking far beyond that to try to ensure that we have full reach in order to monitor and secure our 200 nautical mile exclusive economic zone. And that is how the comprehensive archipelagic defense concept, along with key legislations like the Maritime Zones Law and the Sea Lines Law, are able to provide us with the legal apparatus to enforce what is rightfully ours based on international law. But then again, as you have rightfully mentioned, the capacity gap is an issue. And given that reality, there is no choice but to also cooperate with like-minded countries that share the same vision of keeping the West Philippine Sea free, open, and rules-based. And we are trying to leverage that. So rather than us taking the orders, we are setting the groundwork for cooperation for the security of our waters. And that is something that we have to understand.
So ultimately,
Yeah.
ultimately we should probably feel that this is not us asking for help from America like the past, and more we trying to shape the politics of Southeast Asia, and in fact most of Asia, but maybe specific to our standards instead. So yeah, thank you for that, Sir Don. Let me transition to Attorney Jonry. Please go ahead.
Sir Don, to the point that nations are cooperating with one another, it was reported in the Wall Street Journal recently that many strategists see the world returning to something like the Concert of Nations in Europe during the early 19th century. And under this system, empires recognized each other's spheres of influence worldwide, including the right to oppress and dominate less powerful countries and peoples within those spheres. Now, the Monroe Doctrine of 1823 was allegedly the American version of this idea, proclaiming U.S. hegemony over the Americas and a refusal to get involved in European wars. Now, this month, Trump's incoming National Security Advisor, Mike Waltz, described the president-elect's vision as Monroe 2.0. Is this an accurate statement, or is this an accurate sentiment? And are we returning to this kind of world order?
Well, you know, when we talk about spheres of influence, subconsciously among major powers, it has always been there, you know, to make sure that your immediate neighborhood is intact, you know, based on the interests of a larger state. But then again, that clearly shows that realpolitik is in the lifeline of international and interstate relations. And of course, relative power and power asymmetries are obviously a huge aspect in this, along with the overarching distribution of power that constantly evolves as we are now transitioning to multipolarity. But then again, while realpolitik is very much constant in how states act with one another, there are obviously other aspects that could be infused with that. And these are various norms and values and all these things, identities and institutions that would eventually give more direction to the nature of interstate relation and policy making. So yes, I believe that when we heard the headlines about Trump talking about taking over the Panama Canal, taking over Greenland, for instance, or purchasing Greenland back. That gave some sort of concern for other less powerful countries regarding, for instance, the rise of expansionist rhetoric coming from what they believe to be the beacon of the liberal international order. Um, but then again, looking at the rhetoric aside, I think there is a practical fear in Washington as well. For instance, if you look at the Panama Canal, the number of Chinese merchant ships have vastly increased in that area. When we talk about Latin American states, China is one of the top investors in that area in terms of FDI and even in trade, and to the point that the BRI plays a huge role in influencing their political economic calculations, Panama one being included as well. So there are concerns from a military point of view that if China eventually is able to muster as much of its maritime presence along the Panama Canal, it could eventually turn it into a choke point in times of conflict, which would directly, of course, destabilize U.S. national interests. We talk about Greenland, for instance. China considers itself as a near Arctic state. And that eventually tries to allow it to justify having a more robust presence in waters adjacent to Greenland, such as the GIUK Gap, which is primarily a narrow inlet that connects the Atlantic to the Arctic. So if China again begins to deploy its navy in these areas, that could also be a critical challenge, right? So the challenge is clearly there, but I believe that the way that it was presented seems to be in a more of a liberal way of doing so. But then again, rhetoric aside, I think one of the main goals here is to ensure and to put pressure on Latin American states, for instance, to strike a balance and not fall into China's orbit, which clearly would be destabilizing for the Western Hemisphere. And recently, if not yesterday or this morning, there was a meeting between Washington and the leaders of Panama, where they tried to redraw Panama's economic dependence on China. So I believe that this is the goal. While I think that a clear takeover of these sovereign territories by the U.S. Are unlikely. I think the underlying message here is we have to get our acts together to ensure that China does not continue to take advantage of our lax policies. And if we look into the Arctic, China is bringing in the Russians as well, making sure that their presence is anchored by a more powerful resident Arctic power, right? So these are the concerns. And eventually, when we look into this, we could also see that within the Pentagon, there are two schools of thought that are sort of emerging. One that is centered on the U.S. needing to lessen its resources and military commitments in other areas of the world, such as Europe, such as the Middle East, and the other school of thought is that we need to devote more attention to China, because China clearly is a country that has not only the material capabilities but also the political will to directly challenge U.S. influence. And if we look into the declassified 2019 Indo-Pacific strategy of the United States under Trump, which was eventually declassified as he ended his term, Trump 1.0, the U.S.-China power competition was front and center in the Indo-Pacific approach. So in that regard, the American first version would not necessarily be towards strengthening institutions or the liberal international order or other multilateral institutions, but to pursue cooperation with particular states that are able to also forward U.S. national interests in those parts of the world. So in that regard, for instance, in Southeast Asia, we don't expect a Trump 2.0 to try to empower ASEAN. We see Trump 2.0 try to work with particular Southeast Asian states that would be able to further that goal? I mean, I could give some examples, but maybe we could skip to another question. I could sort of, I don't
Yeah.
want to keep talking. So yeah, there's a lot
Yeah.
of time. Yeah.
No, it's okay. Thank you for that, Jordan. Which I guess leads us, I guess, now to the central concern of our show, which is essentially our trying to assess what Trump's return to the White House means for us. The impression you're giving us, based on the data you've shared so far, is that given yung considerations of the United States, the institutional priorities of its political class in Washington D.C., one gets the impression na this is really just this is really just a seesaw, a back and forth, so to say, of these two schools of foreign policy is manifesting itself, no, in its elections. So parang precisely because America feels insecure, this insecurity translates to this sense that they need to focus more internally, and that insecurity, the impression I'm getting, is what convinced a lot of people to bring back Trump to the White House, apart from, the other potential domestic considerations that happen. No? Is this what came to your mind as well when he ultimately won?
Well,
When the
yeah,
returns were coming in?
yeah,
Uh-huh.
when he ultimately won, I think, in fact, more than the external aspect, it was the internal aspect that really served as a huge catalyst for his win. The domestic audience was not satisfied with Biden's socioeconomic planning and a lot of activities that did not really, particularly immigration. That was another thorn in the consciousness of many Americans towards the Democratic Party. And of course, you link that to more of the external support that the Biden administration was giving to Ukraine, for instance, and all that, the resources that were used, and eventually, all these aspects, eventually, which catalyzed from domestic, dissatisfaction. And that's something that Trump was quick to leverage, that domestic socioeconomic, border-driven dissatisfaction of many in America. And in fact, I believe it was more of the domestic statements and the domestic promises that really got the ball rolling for Trump. But eventually, as he went on to the more pertinent foreign policy issues, he tried to link that with the domestic audience, and that is, we need to prioritize American skills, American capacity. We need to bolster that. I mean, interestingly, he also talked about sanctioning Taiwan's chip industry, where the U.S. is actually gaining significantly from. We talked about sanctions in against Canada, sanctions against. What else? There were a series of sanctions that he introduced, and against Mexico, and the 10% sanction on China, right? So that was with the idea, of course, of serving as a wake up call for many American companies to sort of catch up, right? And to sort of rebalance what he felt to be an unjust economic relationship that the U.S. had with its immediate neighbors. And we see now Canada trying to double down on the comeback with tariffs of its own against the U.S. But then again, the larger concern is how would this fare domestically, socioeconomically? As we can see, tariffs are bound to hurt Americans as well, one way or the other, given the tariffs imposed by Canada on a number of critical factors, right? And of course, the tariffs imposed by Trump, such as the energy sector at 10% and all other sectors at 25%, would also hurt Americans, as they would hurt the Canadians as well. So we are yet to see whether Trump would have a backup plan. as to how he will intend to absorb these initial shocks of the tariffs, and if there are any plans in store to sort of bounce back and to create a more resilient America, because I think that's the goal. So far, these are we're still quite early into the administration, so it's still quite premature to make some guesses. But then again, I believe that's what he's trying to go for. But it's a double-edged sword, really, that could also hurt Americans.
Yeah. Sir Don, regarding your assessment of the Trump movement in the United States, there's also a sense that this populist movement has taken over the progressive movement across all over the world, such that the center-left priorities such as climate change, social justice, and identity politics seem less relevant today. And and to your point again, governments all over the world are more concerned with national rather than international priorities. And so, is this sentiment uh, here to stay? And how does this affect us, seeing as this is seemingly a worldwide trend?
Yeah, I mean, the focus on a more nationally driven policy when we look into the political world map, there is, in fact, as you have rightfully mentioned, a clear shift towards this direction. Um, but of course, I do not think that the shift would be in its purest sense. And I think that it would be selective based on particular industries, for instance. But then again, this is not something that is permanent, and it would eventually evolve based on structural conditions as well. I think we've seen this during the COVID-19 pandemic, when even many of the European countries began to close their borders for trade, etc., began to focus on their national economies rather than pursuing free trade. This was a trend, and in fact, we cannot disregard structural factors in shaping these trends as well. But when it comes to, for instance, the U.S.-China trade competition, there were many in Southeast Asia, such as Malaysia, Vietnam, and Indonesia, that were benefiting from this. India benefited from this as well. And that creates more opportunities. So shutting off certain areas of the world when it comes to trade and all these tariffs also provide opportunities for other states to sort of fill in the gaps. And that's what diversification is all about. But then again, if you look at it in a more holistic sense, this could also lead to fragmentations in the international economic landscape. And I think that there were already concerns over this level of fragmentation rather than integration when it comes to global economic cooperation, where the status of integration is actually much more sparingly divided, and that creates a negative perception as well regarding the overall global resiliency of the international political system. So I agree. I mean, this is, and we're not just talking about economics. We're talking about the movement of people as well. We're talking about the elements that eventually make up the process of globalization: goods, services, the movement of people, technology, access to technology, etc. And globalization, what I'd like to say is more of a process rather than a linear directional force. We've seen this, during the First World War. Prior to the First World War, the economies were highly interdependent of the warring states, but eventually it showed that, when security issues trump economic prospects, then, fragmentation eventually occurs. So what we're seeing today is we are at a volatile state, from the COVID-19 pandemic to the Russia-Ukraine war. The Red Sea attacks, for instance, have all put a huge toll on international economic activities. And then again, you have the factor of power competitions that could further derail the effects of economic integration. Yes, you have RCEP, for instance, which is one of the largest integrative frameworks for economic cooperation. But again, if you look into Eastern Europe and other parts of the world, we can see that this level is increasingly disproportionate, which has always been the case when it comes to the impacts of globalization. But today we're giving much more emphasis to the major economies, and they themselves are competing with one another. And like I said, that creates concerns. But when it comes to the rise of populist sentiments, I think that there is indeed a rise, not just in our parts of the world, but also other parts of the world, where the survival of the state, the survival of particular political elites also play a vital role in catalyzing the spread of these sort of sentiments taking place.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you for that, Sir Don. With that in mind, one thing that has been announced, I hope you don't mind me bringing this in, but one significant development that came out of of Trump's newer executive orders is either the slashing or flat out stoppage of US funding when it comes to international projects and partnerships. So this obviously became a major concern for NGOs and civil society organizations all over the world, and the same is the case in the Philippines. So one thing I've noticed in the past is that clearly our civil society sector and our security sector has been at odds with each other, I guess, because of competing interests, historical conflicts with each other. Do you get the sense that this shift in the relationship with the United States should be a common concern across all of them, or is it also ultimately an opportunity to decide na, you know what, maybe we should not be as reliant on the US anymore as we have been for
Well,
previous years? What's your sense of this?
Well, first of all, I believe that any sort of complacency towards any particular party should not be advocated by any
Mm-hmm.
sovereign state. And I think that
Mm-hmm.
diversifying options is always the way to go for any state, especially ours.
Mm-hmm.
But when it comes to what you've talked about, the ban placed on U.S. development assistance, the
Mm-hmm.
90-day ban, if I'm not mistaken, that ban was eventually, you know, used to review whether certain developmental programs are in fact contributing to the overarching goal of the United States when it comes to its willingness to establish itself in terms of defense and economics in the international system. But then again, if you look at it from a humanitarian point of view, I believe that there are growing concerns about U.S. commitments to for instance, conflict-driven areas. I've
Mm-hmm.
seen some reports where health centers in critical zones were shut down because of the lack of funds, for instance, that was a result of this decision. But for the Philippines, I believe that this review does not cover, many of our defense cooperations with the United States. But of course, when it comes to the humanitarian aspect, I believe some of them were put on hold, but it's still too early to tell whether how long-lasting these limitations would be, given that the main purpose of the review is not to necessarily cancel all of them out, but to create a comprehensive outlook from Washington's perspective regarding which forms of developmental assistance it would prioritize over others. And I believe that in accordance to the American First ideology of Trump, having a strong, robust, and also sustainable Philippines is definitely in the best interest of the United States at this point in time. So I am so quite optimistic that this won't be something that would further derail our developmental economic prospects with the United States. But now that we're on the topic of economics, beyond the developmental assistance, I do worry that we would need to do more in terms of developing a more conducive economic domestic climate to ensure that we are illustrating our ability to house and absorb, for instance, US FDIs. And if you look into the statistics and data, even under the Biden administration, we weren't doing so well compared to our immediate neighbors like Vietnam, Malaysia, or Indonesia. And even they now are concerned whether they would need to do more to attract more FDIs from the United States, given Trump's profit-based transactional approach. So that gives us more of a challenge, but a challenge that should in fact encourage our policy sectors to in fact improve the domestic investment climates we have here. So that I feel is one of the sticking points that that we would need to work on as well for the mid to long term.
Yeah, thank you for that. So you're essentially saying that instead of treating this ultimately as essentially a kneecap, a handicap, we should probably there is an opportunity as well to instead take this as a means to disengage ourselves from that aspect of the American economy that is perhaps riskier than than it needs to be.
Well, here's the thing, given how Washington works and Washington may work under Trump, it is not impossible for certain shocks to occur immediately, such as new plans to put things on hold or to pause them eventually. That would create snowball effects for many countries. So obviously, this is also in line with what Manila is currently doing. We are trying to engage with as many partners as possible in different areas, with the Europeans, with even Czech Republic, for instance. We're dealing with energy, technology cooperation, with Japan as well, with South Korea. We're exploring other means of commodities and cooperation with other countries, with other partners in Asia as well. So in that regard, we are in the right direction in terms of our multi-aligned approach, and that is something that we must continue to leverage. But this is in no way saying that we are decoupling from the U.S. or something like that, as many may want to put it. The U.S. remains vital in our national security and economic calculations, but what we are doing in terms of diversification is to ensure that we have a buffer in terms, in the context of immediate policy changes in Washington, as not to catch us off guard. And I think, like any sovereign state, planning ahead is definitely something that we should continue doing.
All right. Yeah. Maiba naman ako, Hansley, no? Sir Don, earlier this month, Meta announced that it would no longer police speech on its Facebook and Instagram social media platforms. And Mark Zuckerberg spoke of a cultural tipping point towards once again prioritizing speech. Now, with this development in mind, is the era of cancel culture just about over, or has it shifted from left to right?
Well, I'm not really much involved in these popular terminologies, as they say these days. But I do believe that having the right platform to channel what is actually going on, and of course, as we can see, and recently in the Philippines, we've seen several posts as well that were weaponized eventually. You've seen the recent Grab post, etc., that were sort of sensationalized, which led to a number of different socio-economic challenges for workers, right? So, the weaponization of the digital space is in fact one of the most critical issues that we are facing today, and this has also been a medium for the information operations and malign activities and operations that weaponize information as a whole. So in that regard, we could look at this as something that would still be a challenge, given that the digital space is still largely ungoverned, and that creates problems for enforcements and regulations and all these things. So, but I guess since it's still too early to tell, we have to see how this plays out. given that these are just things that have been recently talked about, and it may take some time to eventually see how this would impact society as a whole in the next few months, and eventually then we could probably have a more in-depth conversation about its implications.
Mm, with that in mind, maybe since we are currently on the last 10 minutes of the show anyway, um, maybe it's a good it's a good opportunity to begin looking forward. You mentioned that there are still a lot of things there are still a lot of things that can happen or could be done by the Trump administration. So judgment is still pretty early, perhaps to levy against it. But I think it's not exactly unfair to say that considering the politics, the political party that backs him, and for that matter, the interests that have congregated with Donald Trump and the Republican Party, they don't exactly inspire confidence or they don't exactly inspire good faith, either domestically in the United States or with everyone else in the world. So considering we're currently dealing with that, either their reputation problem they don't want to work with, or this pattern of behavior that has kind of cost a lot of people either lives or opportunities. How therefore do we take that position of not coming into early judgment when they haven't exactly extended an opportunity to assume that they're going to be doing this in good faith or they're going to do this more manageably than the last time?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And one of the more concerning factors would be the infighting between and among the Republicans as well. That also channels questions regarding the sustainability of the policies that would eventually be harnessed under the administration. But then, if you're asking from our point of view, how we intend to cope with this level of uncertainty, we have to understand that and we have said this again and again. Being transactional obviously means that you would have to pursue particular policies that you feel would greatly benefit your immediate interest. And that when you put that and operationalize that through foreign policy, and that would mean, of course, working with particular countries that would allow you to forward your national interest in that regard. And the national interest of America first, from a foreign policy point of view, would be to develop and establish U.S. preeminence in defense and economics, amidst the challenges that are being posed by several factors, one of which including China. So the challenge for the Philippines here is to, at one point, increase the level of agency, improve our ability to negotiate. We have also understood that personality matters under Trump administration, and this is why we've had our Ambassador Romualdez, initially reach out, as early as the election results were out. President Marcos Jr. had a couple of interactions with then President-elect and eventually President Trump. And we had other members, like our National Defense Secretary, and our Foreign Secretary, Secretary Enrique Manalo, already develop robust channels of communication with their counterparts in America. And this is, in fact, one of the most important parts in laying the groundwork. Now, we have to remember, when you asked about not being repetitive of what took place in the past, it was under Trump 1.0, for instance, when the clarity was given for the first time regarding the geographical scope of the Mutual Defense Treaty. That was not even given under the Obama administration. And the whole idea of pursuing an ironclad commitment in the South China Sea, particularly the West Philippine Sea, was also given under that period. But then again, we have to remember that under our former government, we decided to give the cold shoulder to the United States. And that gives us the understanding that we weren't able to maximize what we could have in that regard. Today, I see a more competent leadership in Manila that knows the premise of negotiation and conversation. And with Trump, that is something that is also crucial. But at the same time, the challenge as well is to ensure that we are able to position our national interests within Trump's transactional view of international politics, making it clear that what we are facing, for instance, in our waters, has direct implications for what the US wants to achieve in the international space, particularly the Indo-Pacific. I mean, the U.S. is also faced with limited options right now. Initially you had the Japan, South Korea, U.S. trilateral, but we don't know where that's headed given the domestic political situation in South Korea. So, given being a businessman, you have to maximize your assets and your investments. And what are U.S. assets? They are alliances. And in that regard, one of the reasons why, you know, the US seeks to, for instance, try to pull out of other regions in the world, could actually provide us with the opportunity to have a more focused approach, given that our challenge with Washington for most of our independence and most of our period in the 21st century was U.S. preoccupation away from Southeast Asia, creating a vacuum for China to exploit. And in that regard, we have great competent. I think that the U.S. has quite a number of competent leaders in the Pentagon who are also academics that also understand the need to deal more effectively with the challenges posed by China. And of course, the need to work with partners such as Japan, India, and Australia. So in that regard, we could see that the Pentagon has also issued a position that we do not want to engage in any hot war. Our main initial purpose is deterrence. And how do you deter? By bolstering the capacities of your partners to ensure that they are resilient enough to push back along with your support from the back. But eventually, the statement also said, when the recently nominated U.S. defense chief said that when push comes to shove, the United States will be willing to step up, beyond just deterrence if needed, right? So these are the kind of things that the Philippines must be able to leverage for our own national security. It's about ensuring that we get the long ends of the stick rather than the shorter ends when it comes to negotiating. So that really involves a lot of agency-driven approaches, which I believe that Manila is trying to configure as we are going on. But of course, as uncertainty looms, we also have to keep our options open, working with other countries as well. And I think that that's what we're looking at right now.
So, I guess if we're going to be taking away anything from here, any development in the United States, however bad it could be for the world, doesn't necessarily have to be ultimately bad for us.
For the Philippines, exactly.
Yeah. Okay, so maybe as a closing question for you, Sir Don. Since there are obviously other people who are interested in engaging with these kinds of topics, and in fact, as well for other people who want to advocate for changes in our foreign policy, what would you say in a few words would be the best place to start if we want to advocate for further change in our foreign policy, direction? Where do you think we could still improve?
Yeah, I think we need to improve in consolidating our national resilience. Having a national narrative is very much important, especially when we deal with such tumultuous and complex challenges in our strategic environment. Having that level of resilience from within would allow us more maneuvering space for Manila to, in fact, operationalize that stability into a more effective foreign policy decision making as well. And that is similar for any democracy, to have a more resilient national environment to ensure that it would directly complement the foreign policy goals that we have. By creating that link, we would be able to maximize much more. Fragmentation is always is always a blessing for expansionists and revisionists, and we want to make sure that we try to close that gap in order to facilitate a more holistic position at the international level. So again, that change has to start from home.
Yeah. Thank you very much again for joining us today in our episode, Sir Don. Before
Thank you, Sir
we
Don.
wrap up the show, do you want to promote anything to our audience?
No, I mean, I just hope that we all get to understand the significance of our country, our position, and our interests, and to continue supporting areas that we know directly complement Philippine national interests, security interests, and economic interests. So having these sort of conversations really contributes to that very goal. So I'd like to thank you, sirs, for this wonderful opportunity, and I look forward to conversing more in the future.
Yeah, thank you very much as well, and we hope to have
Likewise,
you
Sir
again
Don.
on the show. Yeah.
Thank you.
So yeah, Sir John, Atty. Jonry, as a closer, what's your takeaway for today?
Ako, siguro, pagka may nangyayari sa US, for sure na mararamdaman natin. Oo.
Yeah. Pero even pero lumalabas nga as per Sir Don, I think mukhang mas mature na rin naman yung relasyon ng Pilipinas at ng Amerika na we're in the same way na we're no longer as dependent on them. There's also a sense na we can approach them now more as equals than we have been in the past. And I guess yun din yung oportunidad for us na tignan kung tayo talaga yung magkakaroon ng independent foreign policy. Let's not assume na unfair ang mundo. Let's act as if we could get something out of it anyway.
Well said.
So yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, and on that, hopefully reflective and hopefully inspiring note, atin pong winawakasan ang ating programa ngayong gabi. Muli po, marami pong salamat sa ating mga tagapakinig ngayong gabi. At muli po, kami po si Hans, kami po si Atty. Jonry. Muli pong magbabalik si Doc Jovi sa ating susunod na palabas sa susunod na linggo. Muli po, magandang gabi. Lundagin mo, Beybeh.
Meron? Ano nga ba ang meron? Paano nga bang mabuhay ng tapat sa meron? Don't you wish you can relive your philo classes? The terror teachers? The terrible oral exams? Or the even terrifying but liberating and life-changing aha moments? Lundagin mo, Beybeh! Here's your chance! Lundagin mo, Beybeh! Kasama ang mga pilosopong sina Jovi Miroy at Ron Capinding. Lundagin mo, Beybeh! Leaping upward, leaping forward. Lundagin mo, Beybeh! Leaping to greater heights, to greater wisdom, to greater magis. Lundag